Hello, and welcome back to episode 4, chapter 3, because we always started with the 0, of our Out of the Abyss RTDFW recap and analysis, hosted by the Dungeon Master of the game itself. My name is David, and our players, as always, are the lovely Criella, Brack, Mallos, Azrael, Roscoe, and Ellie, played by, not in the same order, Ashe, Cameron Hood, Abby, Danny, Chase, and Alex. Where we last left off in our chapter series, the party had just had a unfortunate run-in at the city of Graxon, the Dark Dwarf city in the Underdark, and had inadvertently caused the death of a priest of Bahamut who had been living in the multiracial Dark Lake district, as opposed to the rest of the Dwarven city where no outsiders were typically allowed. And due to the death of this individual, Mallos and Criella found it necessary for a rapid fleeing of the party in quite a bit of haste. After multiple days on the waters of the Dark Lake, they left Graxon after about 2 days. And much to the frustration of the party, they were not happy to be back on that damn boat. But let's get right into what the next steps in their story was, as we've got a heck of an episode here. So, practically a day or so after the departure from Graxon, the party found itself in relative troubled waters, no pun intended, because they were back on the boat, due to the fact that they didn't know the repercussions that would come for the killing of the priest, and also the interaction with one of the servants slash daughters of Lady Saria Darialis, who had been trying to bring a message to the party in general. The party was sailing on their way over to the Neverlight Grove. Now, the Neverlight Grove is one of the most, I don't want to say safe, but it's definitely one of the most less hostile areas of the Underdark. It is entirely run by a race known as the Myconoids, which are a sort of sentient fungal colonies that all work via telepathy. They use telepathic spores that they exude from their body to mentally link up with one another and any outsiders that they interact with. And they typically are a rather ageless species. It's more often than not devoted into various circles who have different duties for the various responsibilities that happen in the Neverlight Grove. There are the sovereigns, who are sort of the chieftains of the group. There are circles of protectorates, the people who guard the outer regions of the Neverlight Grove. There are the circle of builders, the circle of harvesters, a very sort of druidic society, but none of them actually have druidic powers. At the lowest echelon of the social hierarchy, and that's not saying that they're like low social status, just they're at the bottom, would be individuals such as Stool, the myconoid sprout that the party had pseudo-adopted, but more were transporting back to the child's homeland because they knew that if they left Stool in the Underdark, it would almost assuredly perish from the various hazards. But as they left the city of Smog and Ashe, they realized that it was going to be 12 more days, according to Seraph, their guide, towards the Neverlight Grove, which for certain individuals, such as I think specifically the people who were taking the most sort of boat exhaustion, was Brack, because Alex, as a relative newcomer, had still been learning the methods for spell preparation, and had unfortunately been prepping a lot of spells that just weren't really viable on a boat setting. And also, it's always a hassle to re-prepare your spells, and the biggest downside to any sort of divine caster class that prepares its spells, which in 5e at this moment is the paladin as a half caster, and druids and clerics as full casters. The one thing you always come across in spell preparation is the fact that you always want to have a spell that's on your list and you could have prepared, but you just didn't that day. And that's more often than not very niche circumstances, like, oh no, I kind of wish that I'd be able to melt into stone right now, or I wish that I'd prepared Water Walk if I knew that we were going to be going on, like, a body of water. And Alex prepared, for the most part, spells that accommodated that, but they also wanted to try out a lot of other spells that just didn't viably work on a boat setting, such as, like, Earth Tremor or other sort of ground-based techniques. So the 12 days was really difficult for Brack's character, and it was also relatively difficult for the tieflings, Mallos and Criella. They were still kind of shaken by what had been going on. Also, the news that their benefactor, Lady Darialis, was kind of pushing them along, was kind of a source of exhaustion for Mallos at the very least, because he had been putting some strains together that I had been leaving for the party. Danny has I don't want to say bad habit, but he has an annoying habit of taking a mile from whatever inches that I give the party in terms of hints for what's going on. And while stated, again, this isn't necessarily a bad habit of Danny's, it does make what I give the party to sort of confuse or befuddle them. I always have to really pick and choose a lot of my hints. Now, that being said, a lot of the things that I've given them have still not come resolved. And also, this is a good time to get into the fact that when the game started, we set up a group chat for the game. And it has been my absolute delight and terror. I haven't done it recently, mostly due to the fact that a lot of people have been doing really busy stuff. A couple of our players have been in work crunches, and it would kind of be unfair to ask this of them. But it's always a nice sort of way to mess with your players when out of nowhere you just say, hey, so-and-so, roll me this die. And then they roll it, and then you go, okay. And then you don't elaborate on it. And that ranges a lot. More often than not, if I'm asking them to roll multiple die, I'm really just asking them to roll whatever treasure is in the hoard that they're going to find. Although sometimes it can be like, what are the chances of this happening? What are the chances of this happening? And various other circumstances that just make the game more intriguing and also frustrates them until the point where they can actually like see how that came up. And more often than not, I will explain that, yeah, this is what that was. However, back to the actual story recap. As they were sailing away and starting their 12-day venture towards the Neverlight Grove, again, guided by Sereth, who was uncustomarily enthusiastic for heading towards the Neverlight Grove, they found, about a day's in, a very, very bad encounter. So, let's talk about one of the most famous creatures in all of Dungeons & Dragons, and also one of the most selectively dangerous creatures depending on your party composition. And that is of Beholders. Beholders are aberrations that come from the far plane. They are essentially giant meatballs with a lot of eye stalks. You can see in the picture down below a sort of demonstration for what you can expect from a beholder. But beholders in general are extraordinarily dangerous due to their most famous ability, which is a cone of anti-magic that permeates whatever area that their main eye is looking at. Now, that being said, they also have 10 individual eye stalks that all have very fun / dangerous abilities for a dungeon master to use against a party, which is why their threat is very high level for a creature that has relatively low hit points. They're always off the ground, so it's kind of needed to have a sort of flight ability. And in a 5e setting, unfortunately, one of the biggest things about Beholder encounters is there's a very specific cone of vision that nullifies the magic, or rather not nullifies, but suppresses the magic. And when you're on a boat and a beholder shows up to demand that you either forfeit your lives or forfeit a toll, that's a bad circumstance for a party of 6 individuals where 4 of them are mainly spellcasters. Which, as we've gone over in previous episodes, Criella, Roscoe, Mallos, and Brack are all spellcasters, while Ellie and Azrael do have martial capability, but trying to get any sort of flight going that isn't provided by magical items is frustrating. Now, in terms of flying, it's possible that Azrael could have, but that's only if he was what was known as a Protector Aasimar. Aasimar are perhaps my favorite race in 5e. They are the angelic equivalent of tieflings, and they have 2 extraordinary resistances. Just having necrotic resistance innately is kind of fantastic because of how undead-centric a lot of 5e monsters are. Having dark vision is very useful. Having innate light for any party members who don't have visual capabilities in darkness is nice. And their angelic transformation scales very appropriately as it levels up. Having the ability to deal your level in damage can kind of stack up every round. And some of my first 5e characters were Aasimar. In particular, my Fey Pact of the Tome Warlock was a Aasimar, and that was a very fun character to play in that campaign. But unfortunately, Azrael is a fallen Aasimar, who don't get wings, but rather get a sort of a burst of fear magic that then adds necrotic damage, or darkness damage, I guess more colloquially, to whatever attacks they make. So when a beholder showed up, flying over their boat with their main eye directly on the party, and any eyes that weren't ready to go, and some of the things that a beholder's eye can do is it can disintegrate you, it can levitate you, it can charm you into doing things for the beholder, like attacking your allies, it can blast you with necrotic energy. There's a lot of scary things that beholders are capable of doing. Probably the most dangerous is probably the disintegration eye. That can just flat out kill certain characters. And especially at the level that the Breakfast Club was in this particular instance. Also, I'm going to state right now, I apologize if it sounds like there's any sort of congestion. I'm just a little stuffed up today. during this recording. But they just managed to avoid combat / a potential TPK on the boat because Mallos, being the charismatic character that he was, managed to persuade the Beholder to let them pass at the cost of what I believe was 3 or 4 of his magic items, which he was bitter about, but at the end of the day, Danny and Mallos both were smart enough to realize that magic items would come later, potential revivals, not so much. So there was a very tense circumstance that they managed to definitely avoid. And also at the point where, though, as stated, after they turned 5th level, my feelings of gloves off when it comes to combat was kind of already gone. Mainly due to the fact that, A, I'm always outnumbered as a dungeon master, so I have to build it accordingly, or B, the party is far more capable than they give themselves credit for. There have been a couple of circumstances where it was smart to flee from whatever combat that they were going after, which we're going to get into in a bit. But I always want to encourage Abby, Chase, Danny, Alex, Cameron, and Ashe to really feel like they can take on the world. Which they always are very capable of doing, and also just have that level of satisfaction and control that can come from Dungeons and Dragons when you don't always necessarily have it in your real life. Which is another reason that some people view Dungeons and Dragons as kind of therapeutic in certain ways. It's not an equivalency for actual therapeutic help, but there are ways that you can express yourself creatively in a 5e setting that otherwise wouldn't be functionally viable for you. But after that brief tangent, they managed to successfully avoid the Beholder, and they sailed on until roughly about 5 to 6-ish days into their travel, they encountered something rather weird. Now, one of my favorite things to do in 5e is to try and incorporate other games, other media, other instances of fiction into a 5e setting, which more often than not just kind of boil down into one-shots, but they can get expanded into various other things. And in this circumstance, because the Dark Lake is not defined in a 5e standing, there is a section in the book that has possible encounters, but that doesn't actually scale to character level as they continue to go on, because the Dark Lake section implies that a party would be like level 3 or 4 in some of the encounters that they roll. And my characters were well above that level by the time they were leaving Graxlin. So in this circumstance, as they were sailing along, they found themselves hearing the sound of rainfall. Now, like if you're in Atlantis, if you hear the sound of rain while you're underground, that's kind of weird. Now, granted, it could be like a waterfall, but waterfalls have a kind of customary roar. This was like the sound of rain under the earth, which is kind of weird. And what they see in the circumstance is a small kind of reptilian child standing in front of a very old, weathered, and slightly rusted door. Now this child is... Now these 2 bits of media are actually a combination of 2 bits of media that you wouldn't think to merge with one another, but The basis for this is the Underdark is a very strange, almost alien landscape. Anything that is sufficiently suffused in as much chaotic phasers miasma as the Underdark is, there's the chance that something this weird happens. So, as the characters were sailing along, they saw this circumstance and decided, well, they didn't decide, as a party. Ellie decided, and then just to make sure she didn't die, Azrael and Roscoe decided to go to the doorkeeper, and they went into the city that lies beyond the fog. Now, a little bit of backstory for the doorkeeper. The doorkeeper is actually not from the location that the door leads to. The doorkeeper is actually a very hidden character in one of my favorite games of all time, Undertale, and it is a character known as Goner Kid. And the entire premise of Goner Kid is a fragment from a different reality that the player / the reality that the setting is in collides with differently. One of the most haunting quotes from Goner Kid when you meet them in the location that you meet them is, "Have you ever considered a world where everything was the same and functioned perfectly except you didn't exist?" Which, from a philosophical standpoint, is kind of a horrifying thought, especially given the fact that in circumstances like 5e and other circumstances with multiverses, there absolutely are universes where it's implied that the world is a lot different because you're not in it. And what it's supposed to make you do is make you value your existence and the world that you're currently in, and also give you the idea that there's always another world going for you. But Goner Kid being the doorkeeper was just a bit of creepiness that I wanted to insert into the story. Also given the fact that the place that he leads is one of the creepiest in all of fiction. So, let's talk a little about Silent Hill. It is one of the most interesting fictional settings that I've ever really been exposed to, and that's saying a lot, given the fictional settings that I have. It's a small town somewhere. In canon, it's supposed to be West Virginia, but that's never actually been established. The movies try to establish it, but there is a town that had a incident, and whatever the incident was, which that's kind of spoilers, and I recommend that anyone who's listening to this go check out the Silent Hill series. It's scary, but it's more psychologically intriguing than something like a Resident Evil zombie survival. There are monsters, but it's a lot more symbolism. And if you're gonna do any of the games, do number 2. Number 2 is... There's a reason Silent Hill 2 is considered the best horror game of all time. But the town itself is fascinating because it gets into a kind of mirror for whoever enters it. And not only that, it also has a lot of puzzles that, as a dungeon master, you can steal, which is another reason why these videos get unlisted, because I don't want to make it sound like I'm profiting off of other people's work. That's plagiarism. But the town itself is fascinating, and it also changes according to whoever goes in. To the mind of a little girl who wanders into the town, it's just going to be an empty town, because there's no darkness in that individual's heart. In the mind of a murderer who escaped from his home after killing a person, it's going to be filled with monsters and whatever symbolizes the crime/sin that he committed. So the town itself varies very differently with every new visitor that comes to it. And it's also very multi-layered. There can be multiple people with skeletons in their closet at the town at once, and they are all viewing it as a different sort of place, which the games get into, and it's again why I encourage people to go into it. But as Azrael, Roscoe, and Ellie went into the town, it got into one of my most favorite puzzles that really I've ever seen in a game. So as they entered the door, they entered into a very sort of graded, sectioned off sort of series of corridors that led to a main door at the end of the hallway where they entered, and then 2 adjoining sort of wing doors. So basically imagine like a giant, almost like a giant H, like a helipad H, with a door directly in front of them, and then the 2 hallways. And as they got into the 2 hallways, they found 2 different rooms that had 6 6 hangman gallows in each of them. One of them had 6 empty gallows, and the other of them had 6 bodies that had been hung and had pieces of paper over their face describing what the crime was that they had did. So in one of the rooms, as stated, there were the 6 cadavers, and they all had pieces of paper over their face, which if the party had tried to remove, they would have found that they were unable to do so. But the pieces of paper said that there was a murderer, there was a kidnapper, a thief, a counterfeiter, an embezzler, and an arsonist. And as they entered the other room, they saw a sign that said, "Only the innocent man can lead you through the path back to safety," which implied that one of the individuals had been wrongfully killed for their crime. So in that circumstance, what I did was use the riddle from the game, which was, dead men, swinging in a tree, how many dead men do you see? Tongue-tied blue and face gone gray, watch them as they twist and sway. The first one killed the butcher man, then cooked him in the frying pan, served him to his hungry guests, and gave them seconds on request. The next one, with his smile and sweets, stole poor children off the streets. To men who dressed unsavory, he sold them into slavery. Breaking into homes at night, the thief he had a nasty fright, filled his foolish head with ale, and woke in the morn in the county jail. The artist with his daunting skill, tried his hand at painting bills, but caught in rain he was undone, when the ink he'd used did start to run. With promises of great return, taking gold he did not earn, bundled it up out of sight, quietly slipped off into night. 3 houses into ashes burned, the sheriff with no place to turn, did spy a stranger in his town, locked him up and beat him down. Dead men, swinging in a tree, how many dead men do you see? 6 foot long and 6 men wide, round their necks the noose be tied. Now, I'll give a brief pause, a couple of seconds, for y'all to try and think of which of those 6 individuals was actually the innocent man, although the riddle makes it relatively clear as to what the correct answer is. If you guessed arsonist, you're absolutely correct. So, and Ellie, Roscoe, and Azrael were all smart enough to realize this as well. So when they went into the empty gallows room, the one that didn't have the cadavers, they pulled on the rope that was symmetrical to the other room where the arsonist had been hung. When they went back to that room, they found that the body was missing and that a key was on the ground, known as the Key of the Persecuted, and they went and unlocked the door, and because they completed the puzzle adequately as well, they were granted a boon, which for this was a charm of heroism as described in the DMG. I always want to include the bits of Silent Hill because that with legitimate rewards for whoever enters the door when Goner Kid shows up, because when I do that, it not only encourages the players to explore whatever puzzle is set up, but it also encourages them to use their heads creatively to solve a puzzle, and hopefully it'll get them vaguely more interested in the media that I'm trying to expose them to. Because I always love to gush about the bits of fiction and fun that I've experienced with my friends. I can't tell you how many times I've said, hey, you guys should play Undertale or Deltarune or Terraria or etc, etc, etc. Just because I so thoroughly enjoy these bits of media, and I want them to experience this too, and what better way than with a knife to their throat, where if they had gotten the answer wrong, they would have had to fight a series of very awful creatures. More often than not, it would probably have been something, if they had picked the wrong noose, from the ceiling, 3 creatures of relative high CR, which is challenge rating in 5e, if y'all forget, from Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, would have fallen from the ceiling, and there are beings who are undead that hit kind of like trucks and are also really, really dangerous. These beings, for the most part, are based off of like aspects of negativity. So creatures like the hungry, the lonely, the lost, the angry, creatures that are undead in nature but also hit like trucks and would probably severely fuck up at least Roscoe and Ellie. Azrael would survive a bit longer because most of whatever I would throw at them in that setting would deal necrotic damage. And as stated previously in the episode, Aasimar get necrotic resistance innately. So Azrael would have survived a little bit longer, but they still would have come out on the other side relatively damaged. But the puzzle was straightforward enough that they didn't have any problems, and they all came out with a charm of heroism, which just lets them use the heroism spell without concentration once, and then it's used. And the rewards get higher and higher as they go on. And it wouldn't be their only time that they entered the City of Fog in our campaign, but we'll get to those in future episodes. So as Azrael, Roscoe, and Ellie came out, they eventually finally landed themselves at the entrance of the Neverlight Grove. It was around this point that Alex had been stating that they were kind of dissatisfied with how the Circle of Moon worked, and they really wanted to get into another circle. And more often than not, I'm fine with that. The one class that really has the most trouble switching from one source to the other is typically Sorcerer, because Sorcerers are more often than not born with their capabilities. But even then, there are circumstances where you can allow transitions. For instance, if Mallos/Danny said he wanted to swap to that of a wild magic sorcerer, I'd say that's easy enough. And I would introduce a sort of overdose of Phasrus that shifted him at a molecular level and got rid of his Draconic capabilities with the benefits of wild magic, as listed in the player's handbook, and it would also be adapted so that he wouldn't lose some of the pre-prepared spells that he already has. It would be adjusted accordingly. He wouldn't just have to go to the vanilla, so to speak. But in terms of Brack, Alex wanted to be in the Circle of Wildfire, which is a relatively new circle that I believe was introduced in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which the book itself had come out a little bit either before or after the campaign actually started. And the transition to the Circle of Wildfire wasn't one that would cause a whole lot of complications. Essentially, as soon as Brack landed with the rest of the party at the edge of the Dark Lake that would lead to the Neverlight Grove, he performed a ritual in which his very essence of the moon was changed to that of flame, and he also had, which I unfortunately forgot to include in the picturing, I apologize, Alex, but as you can see, I did find a kind of badass picture of a Circle of Wildfire Druid. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of gnomish circles of Wildfire Druids. You know, time to commission, I guess. He managed to summon a sort of, almost like a sparrow or of fire, known as Flare, who has abilities such as blasting people with fire and teleporting Brack very short distances, and just a general companion down there in the Underdark. And it's been very interesting watching Alex play Brack as a Circle of Wildfire Druid, as it takes away some of the shape-shifting capabilities of what Brack was capable of, but it's also increased to the fact, like, always having Revivify prepared is nice, because Tasha Druids have spells all the time, as opposed to PHB Druids, because power creep in 5e. Or the fact that they have minute teleportation, and fire is, although one of the most commonly resisted abilities in 5e, it's still a very useful thing to have, because it can serve as light sources, it can warm you in cold environments, there's a bevy of factors, and it's been very interesting watching Brack progress in his journey thus far. However, as they entered the Neverlight Grove, they first were kind of taken aback by the sort of otherworldly beauty that the grove has. The Neverlight Grove itself, as previously stated, is one of the less hostile areas. There are still dangers, like there are shambling mounds, there are plant-based creatures. On their way back to the Neverlight Grove, which we'll get into, there was the possibility of encountering a being of mold that was very dangerous, but we'll get into that in a future episode. But the Neverlight Grove in itself is a very weird and majestic place, to the point where some of the characters have stated like they would be okay just residing there. They'd be fine with that. Unfortunately, though, they found that there was some bits of plant growth that were not native to the Neverlight Grove. That Stool, who was a native, said that's a little weird. They also found that various myconoids that they spoke to, once they were introduced to the myconoids proper, various myconoids were speaking in a relatively weird manner. A sort of like a, "Hello, visitors! We're so glad that you're here! Welcome, welcome! The promised time is close at hand, and the wedding will commence in due time. We welcome you, bring you to the Garden of Welcome." Very sketchy kind of stuff, which a lot of the party members quickly took up on, which was mainly due to the fact of A, how weird it is, and B, at this point, none of my players really trust a lot of what I say, which, you know, that's always good, because when I am telling them the truth, that makes it so that they run into damage that or danger that they could have avoided, which is hilarious. But the myconoids themselves were kind of divided in half. There was one sovereign, Philo, who was acting as previously stated, while the other siren, Basidia, was acting a lot more normal and like, yeah, Philo's been acting weird. Certain people came into our grove a while ago and haven't come back from the Garden of Welcome. It's pretty spoopy stuff. But the party was still a lot more at ease in the Neverlight Grove than they were in the other sections of the Underdark. Which was also due to the fact that once again they had a run-in with Sassafras, which always sort of brightens their spirits, and they had collected a bit of coin in their travels from leaving Graxlin, because I had a couple of encounters that, unfortunately, I don't remember the entire full details of. But, you know, there was still money to be had. But as they solved problems for the myconids and also learned more about what was going on, they eventually came across a rather difficult circumstance, which was a kind of branching of paths. They had two options. In one path was Sovereign Basidia, the more grounded sovereign who was making far more sense and said Philo was acting kind of weird, said that some strangeness had been going on towards a place called the Garden of Welcome that Philo had been encouraging people to go to, and also that way off in the distance there was a gargantuan tower of fungus that had appeared quite recently at that location. Another thing of note was that a tall metallic object had been seen kind of staining a section of the Neverlight Grove's earth, just like a piece of metal that in the area around it, everything had been dying. And beyond that path, Basidia also warned that there was an ancient evil that lived at the edge of the grove, and it would probably behoove the party to have avoided the creature as the creature feasted on the life force of creatures in the Underdark. So, you know, a couple of adventure hooks for me to throw at the party. And the first thing that they did eventually was head over to the Garden of Welcome, which, when they got to the Garden of Welcome, they unfortunately had to deal with the demise of an NPC. So, Sereth is a member of the NPCs in Vecnavelv, the very first place that the party starts, that is the most competent in guiding the party through the Underdark. He's always very eager to want to go to the Neverlight Grove, and it's never explicitly stated why, if not under closer sort of inspection of him, which he doesn't really want to do. He just has like a compulsion urge to get to the Neverlight Grove. Now, in the picture of him on the left, you can see sort of near what would be his right side of his forehead, They're these sort of growths that are present throughout the entirety of the story, and the party didn't really, like, pick up a whole lot on this, because he was just sort of acting as a guide. But the growths themselves are actually the demonic spores of a demon lord of fungi, known as Zuchtmoid, the Lady of Rot. So when they got to the section that had that was known as the Garden of Welcome, with almost an ear-shattering scream, Sereth's entire body bursts open like he had a face hugger inside of his brain, and he turns into what is known as a spore servant. And unfortunately, he's kind of doomed from the start. You have to be level 9 or higher, which I don't believe the party was at that particular instance, and or have access to the spell Greater Restoration. Greater Restoration will cure a afflicted being who has Zuchtmoid spores inside of their body, but in that circumstance, the compulsion to go towards the Neverlight Grove and to bring others to the Neverlight Grove would have vanished from Sereth, and he more likely or not would have instead brought them to Mezerbranzan as a ploy to try and get back into the graces of the individuals who he had shamed, because the reason he's in that cell is because he has a blackout moment where he kills his previous party under the effects of the demonic spores. He has no memory of this, though. This is information that is only accessible to the Dungeon Master, so unless the party had decided to enter his dreams or tried like a very complicated casting of Detect Thoughts, they unfortunately wouldn't really have access to that information as reference, which is another perhaps a shortcoming of the book, but again, it's always nice to have a few of the NPCs with the party, because if you have none, you will get lost in the Underdark. It's implied you should always have at least Jimjar or Sereth, sometimes both, as members of the party, because they're the ones who know their way around the Underdark the best. So when they got to the Garden of Welcome, they unfortunately lost Sereth to his spory demise, and they were attacked by a heavily mutated by the spores third sovereign, who they rather quickly dispatched, and the party noted that this was a relatively easy encounter. The reason this was a relatively easy encounter was not only were they a couple of levels higher than what they needed to be, but the book itself has the encounter as kind of difficult, but not really. Like, he has one ability that can kind of do damage, but he can't actually infect people with Zuchtmoid spores. And the one legendary resistance doesn't really matter because his saving throws are so garbage in the first place that it's very easy to burn through that kind of defense. But the party was sufficiently shaken by what they saw at the Garden of Welcome and reported back to Sovereign Basidia that such an instance had been happening. And though they debated on attacking Philo, I believe it was either Azrael or Mallos who brought up the fact that Philo's actions weren't really his own, because if he also was infected by Zuchtmoid's spores, then it's essentially just mind control or parasitism. Or actually, the best way to describe it is Zuchtmoid is kind of like Starro the Conqueror from DC Comics, or if anyone saw The Suicide Squad. It was a very she's a very In terms of the grand scale of the Demon Lord, she's actually on the lower echelons of power. She doesn't even hold a candle to Gratz, Orcus, Demogorgon, or even someone like Yanogu. She very much works in a collective manner. But it was Mallos who decided that if Zuctamoy was here, then that meant that she was the second of the Demon Lords who had gotten out of the Abyss. Title card. But also meant that Jubilix, the progenitor of all oozes in the multiverse, and the Demon Lord of oozes, and the being known as the Faceless Lord, who shared her level of the Abyss, and her kind of arch nemesis / rival, it basically determined that, oh no, if she was out, he might be out, and that means that there's probably 3. There was also the mention, and I unfortunately failed to mention this earlier, is one of the bits of information that the child / handmaiden of Lady Saria Darialis did when she was interacting with the rest of the party, who was not Mallos and Criella, in Graxlin, was she mentioned that a Demon Lord had exerted their presence in the city itself, but they didn't know which one. And they had exerted that presence on the king of the Dark Dwarfs, which was kind of bad news. So, you know, lots of Demon Lords around, and more gray hairs for Mallos's beautiful head of hair, because just stress, I guess. And for the rest of the party. But when you're the thinker of the party, you start to overthink and overanalyze, and some people's brains are kind of wired like that, which can lead to stress. Just, I'm stressed, so I'm going to think about being stressed, which is going to cause me to be stressed. And it's this whole thing. The best instances for those circumstances are to try and calm down, take a collective, prioritize things, and deal with what you can. And what they could deal with at the moment was investigation of the weird object that the Sovereign had mentioned was over at the section of the Neverlight Grove. So after sufficiently warning Sovereign Basidia, who promised to escape with the non-infected beings of her race, along with Stool, who was not infected. Stool was never a time bomb. Stool was just a child. They decided to, the party decided to go investigate the object, which was one of the most ruinous decisions that they possibly could have done. So, when they got to the actual area, they saw that there was a hill-like mound with a strange acidic greatsword that was embedded into the ground. And the blade itself was known as Wave of Sorrow. I think the magical word is like Angmar, something witch kingy of Angmar sort of thing. A very silly name. It's Wave of Sorrow. And Mallos, being the scholar of the group, so to speak, he is a follower of Ioun after all, Mallos realized that's the sword of the Demon Lord Gratz, the Demon Lord of Desire and Pleasures, and the being known as the Dark Prince. Now, when they found the sword, as Mallos was working out what the sword was, Ellie and Azrael decided to go up and try and see if they could pull the blade out of the ground. And while they were getting a little bit of headway, just from the fact that it was possible for them to attune to Wave of Sorrow, I was making it so that they had to show their will to the blade, which holds an essence of Gratz's self inside of his own blade. A fragment of his, not the full thing. But the blade itself required blood and hit point loss in order to attune to it. But as they were messing with this, and Ellie was putting blood onto the blade and was starting to pull the blade out, Mallos did call out to them that, hey, this is the blade of Gratz, the Demon Lord. And I know that's not what you sound like, Danny, as you're listening to this as Mallos, but, you know, have to try. As he said the word Gratz, Criella, the mysterious NPC, almost in a daze, just sort of murmuring the word, started to walk very slowly towards the blade, and Mallos, trying to stop her, attacked her with a firebolt cantrip, which hit her square in the back and burned away the back of her clothes to reveal that the runic seal that had been carved into her back had cracked. As Criella stepped up and picked up the blade, the fire from Mallos' attack turned into an ebony black and surrounded the entirety of her being as a rather sinister laugh came out from the flames, and Gratz, the Dark Prince, revealed himself in his entire splendor to the party. And this was a big moment of panic. But it also explained some of the instances that had been leading up to the reveal that Criella had been Gratz. First and foremost, when they asked her name at the very initial, I said Criella because I'm not very creative, and just decided to say Gratzelia, Gratzelia, there you go, Criella. That's the NPC's name. And they were like, neat, and that was the end of that. Because thankfully none of my players were super invested into, or super deep dived into demonic lore, which was thankful because there was entire sections in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes about multiple members of the Demon Lords who show up in this campaign setting via the book. And Gratz has his own section in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. The reason that Gratz looked the way he did, if you'll remember the picture from one of our previous episodes, was not only due to the fact that Gratz is the Demon Lord of Desire, he is also the progenitor, for the most part, of the entire existence of incubi and succubi in the 5e setting, which are demons who disguise themselves as beautiful men and women, or whatever floats your boat, and seduces their victims and then steals their souls via that way. If you sleep with a succubi or an incubi, you're considered to have your soul cursed and doomed to go to whichever of the fiendish realms that particular being goes to. And I say fiendish realms because Gratz is a rare instance of not being from the Abyss in general. It is commonly believed that Gratz's origins comes from actually the Nine Hells, where he was a archdevil under the rule, so to speak, of Asmodeus, the king of the Nine Hells, and he found that the Abyss would be far more to his suiting, and he wouldn't be bound by the rules and stipulations that come from being a devil in the Nine Hells. Again, devils and demons are very similar, but devils have very specific rules that they abide by, while demons don't have any. And Gratz didn't want any rules. So his appearance was not only based off of the fact that he is the progenitor of most incubi and succubi, which means that for his appearance, he had to be a 11 out of 10 bombshell of a being. So that was the art that I chose, and it won over various members of my party. But also,
the fact that he was the blonde temptress that he was is based off the fact that in not 5e canon specifically, but in Dungeons and Dragons lore, the goddess Joaquin, a chaotic neutral to chaotic good goddess of mercantilism, and also just not necessarily a minor goddess, but still a goddess in her own divine right, once had the foolish idea to try and go through the abyss to get somewhere, and she figured that the best place to do that would be to go through Gratz's lair, because Gratz has the most traversed section of the Underdark of the abyss, as there's still a semblance of rules. It's basically just like, imagine a endless plane of orgy and miseries is kind of his plane of the abyss. And that led into various circumstances where she was eventually held hostage at his castle. And the only way that she managed to escape from that situation was to sell pieces of her divinity to Gratz. So Gratz is one of few demon lords who actually has access to divinity, which he uses on occasion, which whenever Griselia used spells, I was very, very careful to choose spells that not only showed up on the cleric spell list, but on the Fiend Warlock spell list. So spells like Flame Strike are perfect for that if you look into the player's handbook, as it's one of the few that's on both. So there was, and the reason why Gratz's name broke the seal a little bit was that when the priest in Graxton perished, what he was about to say was, "What have you done? Do you know who this is? This is Gratz, the Dark Prince." That's what he read from the seal. And then the seal, as the person, as it was placed on Gratz as he emerged from the abyss by the spellcaster who accidentally brought the Demon Lords in the first place, the seal was put on Gratz because it had to go on one of the big three. The seal had to go on Demogorgon, Orcus, or Gratz. And in a bit of choosing for myself, the main antagonist of the story was always going to be either Orcus or Gratz. And it just came down to a coin flip, and it depended on which the circumstance was going to be. So when I went with Gratz, that led to the story that we've had thus far. And as Gratz emerged from the flame, his first act was not hostility, it was gratitude. He was very, very grateful to the party for the way that they had been looking after him in his almost amnesiac state. And he began to make offers of his aid and patronage to the party. Now, for some people, this fell on deaf ears, such as Mallos, who as soon as he saw Gratz started to run, because he said, because fight or flight kicked in for Mallos, and he immediately began to run. But other members of the party were not so lucky. Azrael was the only one who tried at first to start dialogue with Gratz, but that dialogue quickly escaped as the party began to both flee and attack Gratz. Most specifically, it was Roscoe and Ellie who started martial combat until they quickly realized that this being was well out of their scope to be able to handle them. So as he eventually said, "Well, if you won't take my help, then you'll learn what happens now that you're attacking me." And from Gratz's point of view, it was just self-defense and trying to teach a lesson for the most part. which led to the loss of another of the player characters. This one led to the loss of Roscoe, again played by Chase. And Roscoe's death was the first instance of a relatively permanent death, because though they probably now have the capability of resurrecting Roscoe, there's a difference in the way that resurrection works in 5e. Revivify is just like using a defibrillator or like a Phoenix Down in a fantasy/RPG setting. It's a way to bring someone who just died back up, as they start to slip from consciousness. But as Roscoe died, like fully died, unfortunately the party decided to try and escape from the grove as Gratz was mercilessly slaughtering first Roscoe, and then although Ellie managed to escape because rogues are handy like that, Brack would have met the same fate if not for Jimjar unexpectedly teleporting in front of Brack and taking a hit that was meant for Brack. But Roscoe, as he faded into the light, Roscoe didn't really want to come back. He was reunited with his significant other on the other side of this mortal coil, and though he had some regrets about the party, Roscoe knew that the party was well and more than capable of handling it from here, and though it would be tough, they were strong enough to do it. So he walked off into the light, and Jimjar and his body faded lifelessly as the ground began to rumble under the party, which helped them escape from Gratz, as well as some sort of interference coming from the remnants of his seal, as a purple worm, which I will show in our next episode, emerged from the ground and swallowed the party whole and took them off to parts unknown. And that was one of the first instances where one of our players had to roll up a new character in our Out of the Abyss setting, which we will get into next episode as we go into the edge of the Neverlight Grove, the revelation of Gratz's revelation, and the meeting of the party's benefactor. So, as always, this has been David, the Demon Lord Dungeon Master. Thank you for watching/listening, and don't be afraid of the dark. Have a good day, everyone.